In high stakes moments, conflict, resistance, how does credibility change the outcome of that situation?
The more common type of conflict is the type where the other person is the one you want to persuade, right? So you've really got to start with understanding where they're coming from. I often say when you communicate, you share perspectives. When you advocate, you change them. And in those situations, you've got to communicate first, and then you can start advocating. But if you don't understand their perspective,
Welcome to Evoke Greatness, the podcast for bold leaders and big dreamers who refuse to settle. I'm your host, Sonnie. I started in Scrubs over 20 years ago, doing the gritty, unseen work, and climbed my way to CEO. Every rung of that ladder taught me something worth passing on. Lessons in leadership, resilience, and what it really takes to rise. You'll hear raw conversations, unfiltered truths, and the kind of wisdom that ignites something deeper in you. Your courage, your conviction, your calling. This show will help you think bigger, lead better, and show up bolder in every part of your life. This is your place to grow. Let's rise together. What if the one thing most leaders chase, charisma, isn't actually what earns trust? In this powerful conversation, former trial lawyer and credibility expert Heather Hansen breaks down why credibility, not charisma, is the true currency of leadership. Drawing from decades inside courtrooms where persuasion can determine life-altering outcomes, Heather reveals the surprise elements that cause people to believe you or quietly stop trusting you. In part one of this conversation, we explore why leaders often mistake credentials for credibility, the three elements of the belief triangle that determine whether people trust you, how subtle behaviors quietly erode credibility over time, and how curiosity and listening unlock deeper influence. If you lead people, influence decisions, or want to build trust that lasts, this episode will change how you think about communication forever. Let's hop into it. Welcome back to another episode of Evoke Greatness. Today's conversation is one I am genuinely excited about because it challenges a belief that so many leaders quietly carry. My guest is Heather Hansen, a former trial lawyer turned internationally recognized speaker, author, podcast host, and credibility expert. Heather has spent decades inside courtrooms where persuasion isn't about being loud, flashy, or charismatic. It's about being believed. She's the author of The Elegant Warrior, How to Win Life's Trials Without Losing Yourself, a powerful guide for leaders who want to stand firm, communicate clearly, and lead with conviction without sacrificing their values or identity. As the founder of Belief Builders and the voice behind the Elegant Warrior philosophy, Heather teaches leaders how to build trust, command presence, and influence outcomes through credibility, not performance. She believes credibility beats charisma every single time. And in a world obsessed with confidence hacks and personal branding shortcuts, her work brings us back to what actually moves people to trust, follow, and say yes. So today we're unpacking what credibility really is, how leaders unknowingly erode it, and how to build influence that lasts, especially when stakes are high. Heather, thanks for being here.
oh my gosh, Sonnie, it's such a pleasure.
What drew you into the courtroom in the very first place?
When I started college, I was a psychology major and I wanted to be a psychologist. And then I really recognized that I loved storytelling. I loved performing. I loved speaking and reading were my favorite things. And so I went to law school very focused on the idea that I was going to be a trial attorney. I didn't want to do corporate. I didn't want to do mergers and acquisitions. I wanted to be a trial attorney. And I was really fortunate because I started working at a firm where I left in 2023. So for that long, I was at the same place, and it was a medical malpractice defense firm. And I just loved defending those cases because those cases I could relate to because I have a knee. So a knee replacement surgery case, I could understand the biology and the anatomy of that. And I loved representing healthcare providers. And so I did that for many, many, many years, decades, until I recognized that I never wanted to retire, and yet I was ready for a change. And that's when I started sort of doing a whole lot of other things that brought me here.
Was there a moment in your legal career where you realized persuasion wasn't really about charisma? I imagine there was some moment where you thought, no, this is about something deeper.
Yeah, I recognized, well, a couple things. One of the things I recognized is it doesn't matter how well I do if the witnesses don't do well. And so I really recognized that my job wasn't to be this charismatic performer, which I sort of hoped it would be, but my job was to teach witnesses how to communicate with charisma, yes, but more importantly, with compassion and credibility. Because if they could do that, then we were more likely to win. And I also knew that no matter how charismatic a witness was, no matter how well they spoke, the jury might think they were nice or funny or kind or smart. But if the jury didn't believe them, we would not win. And so credibility became the top line thing that we were always focused on so that we could make sure that every step of the way, the jury believed that we were telling them the truth. And I have a belief triangle that we can talk about so that they would go into that jury deliberation room believing us, believing in us, and believing that we could help them do their job and come to a verdict.
Yeah. Did doing that work shape the way you look at and think about communication and leadership today?
Completely. I mean, there's so much about it that has shaped me for better and worse, right? It definitely has made me very aware of other people's perspectives. I'm always looking at what's the other side of this? What are they going to say? I just coached someone yesterday who was in a conflict and we looked at it from that other person's perspective as if we were that person. Like where are they? One of the things I have people do is victim, villain, victor. We often think that we are either the victim or the victor. And how are we the villain? Because if you can see that, I often say you can't win until you see how you're going to lose. So that has made me very good at that. But sometimes, Sonnie, that hurts me, right? Because it makes me risk averse and it makes me always looking at where some of my clients have called me Chicken Little. But I know that that kind of preparation is enormously helpful for communication. And it also makes me very tuned into credibility. I'm very good at hearing inconsistencies. And those inconsistencies, when I hear them, do make me question that person's credibility. And the last thing I'll say is in the courtroom, everyone swears to tell the truth. And then they all tell different stories and the jury decides what is true. And it's really led me to see that people believe in their stories. And sometimes the truth is sort of hidden in between all of the stories that you hear.
I imagine the anticipation of what is going to be thrown at you next, especially in a trial. You are constantly assessing, evaluating, and anticipating what may be coming next. I'm curious, it just kind of came to my mind. Has that ever impeded your communication? Has it ever kind of gotten in the way of kind of seeking to understand?
Yeah, I think especially when you're younger and deposition. So we have depositions, which is where we communicate with witnesses and ask questions so that we can prepare questions for trial. And so at deposition, you don't want to be preparing for what's next. You really want to be completely open and curious. And as a young attorney, you do sort of have this tendency to have your list of questions and you know where you want them to go. And you don't really even listen to the answers because you just want to get to the next question on your list. The best attorneys quickly learn that that is not going to be fruitful. And so you've got to sort of put a different hat on. And when you're doing depositions and discovery, for those of you that aren't in the law, anytime you want to be discovering, you want to ask those open-ended questions. Tell me what you want me to know about this situation. How are you feeling? How did you feel? And then later, if you get to a point of conflict, like we are in the courtroom, then you can ask those yes or no questions and know that you're prepared for the answer. So you've got to sort of code switch a little bit in order to not mess yourself up in each of those two situations.
I know leaders fall into that pothole a lot around they already have kind of the narrative made up in their own mind as or before they're asking the question. How would you guide someone to almost hit the pause button on themselves to say, hey, be open to truly seeking to understand?
I think that when you recognize that when you have something in mind and a GPS set to where you want to go, you are missing some of the best treasures. I mean, when I really got my mentees to understand that if they're so set on getting this particular thing from this witness, they're missing out on the discovery of treasures. And for leaders, the treasures are often in the people that you aren't even thinking to ask those questions of, right? I worked with one healthcare organization that the people at the front desk had the most insight about what patients' questions were of anyone at the entire organization. But they never thought to tap into their knowledge because the leaders were so focused on getting those FAQs, frequently asked questions, up on the website and sort of not tapping into the knowledge of some of their staff. So you've got to get really curious about your organization, the people who work there, their needs, their benefit, the benefit that they bring to the organization. And then you can focus more and more and more and more as you get towards that final goal.
Yeah. You often say credibility is more important than charisma. Why do leaders get this part wrong so often?
I think that they assume that they are credible. I think that oftentimes we know that we're telling the truth and they think it's that easy, right? I'm telling the truth. And so, of course, I'm credible. And also, and this is a major thing, a lot of people think that credentials are credibility. I went to Harvard. I have all this experience. I have my MBA. And neither telling the truth, that's part of credibility. But credentials aren't as important as people think they are, especially people who have a lot of them, including myself, right? Like I'm not trying to put those people down, but we tend to fall back on our education, our training, our experience, instead of recognizing that the biggest part of credibility is people believing that you can help them. And that doesn't mean that you have all these credentials. It means that you understand their problem and care enough to actually do something to solve it.
Yeah, and that truly is so much a part of leadership, right? Is to be that trusted partner. Charisma is great, right? But ultimately, charisma will only take you so far if you're lacking the element of credibility.
Without a doubt. And charisma, you have to have credibility in order to have charisma, right?
Hmm.
People need to believe you. There's a great a man named Dr. John Antonakis. He's a researcher on charisma, and he does really well-developed, well-founded research studies on what does charisma even mean? And what does it take to be charismatic? And he came out with 12 charisma learning tools. I think they're called CLTs. And there are things like some of them are pretty straightforward. Storytelling is one, metaphor is one, a list of three, asking rhetorical questions, those things. But also, it's understanding the sentiment of the group that you're leading. It is having a high moral goal for that group. It is a belief that the group can reach that goal, which presupposes that you know the group enough to say that. And so all of those things are also inherent in credibility. So you can't not have credibility and be charismatic, but you can try to be charismatic without credibility. And that's when you fall short because you might have the tone of voice and the facial expressions and the body language that a lot of people think of as charismatic. But if you don't have that belief that your people can achieve the goal and they feel that from you, and you don't have that high moral goal and you understand the group sentiments, you're missing some of the key components of truly being charismatic.
Will you walk us through the belief triangle and what do people need to pay most attention to there?
So oftentimes when people come to me and they want to build their credibility, they think that credibility is all about that resume. And that's part of the belief triangle. It's the believe in you piece, right? They have to believe in you that you can do the thing that you say you're going to do. And that is an important part. And you do want to have that experience, that training, that education, the referrals, the recommendations. That's all one side of the triangle. And then the other side is the very straightforward believe you. When you make a promise, you keep it. When you set an expectation, you meet it. And when you can't, you own it. So these are the two sides. And we can dive into each of these because they all go deeper, of course. But those are two sides of the triangle. The foundation, the most important part, is they have to believe that you can help them. So if I tell this in the metaphor of a jury in the courtroom, if I put an expert on, the believe in you piece is what's their curriculum vitae? What's their experience? What's their backgrounds? That's the believe in you piece. Believe you is that they don't say something to the jury that's inconsistent with something they said to someone else 2 weeks ago, right? That's the believe you piece. Believe you can help them is their ability to overcome the curse of knowledge and talk to a jury with a wide diversity of education and experiences in a way that that jury can really understand complicated medicine. And if you have those two things, they believe in you, you have a great CV, and they believe you, you're not a liar, but you're talking about osteomyelitis and they don't know what that means, you will not have credibility with them. And the next person might not have the amazing CV and might actually be stretching the truth here and there. But if they're able to connect with the jury and make them feel like, oh, I understand, they're going to be found more credible.
How does credibility show up differently when it comes to a leader versus an individual contributor?
I think that leaders have, well, first of all, the standard is higher, right? You've got more people who are expecting more things of you. And it's harder because to believe you can help them, we were talking about this before we hit record. People in Gen Z are going to need different things in that regard than the millennials are, than the Gen X are, and then, people, men and women, different backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds. And so as a leader, you really have to, and the other part of this is as we get more powerful, we get worse at this. There's MRI research of the brain that shows that as we get more powerful, we lose that empathy, the ability, cognitive empathy, to see things from another person's perspective, because we don't have to, but we actually do. And so I think that for leaders, there's a natural loss of the impetus to see things from others' perspectives. And then also there's a need to see things from so many others' perspectives that it's really challenging. Whereas the individual contributor, they know they have to see things from their up the chain of commands perspectives in order to get to where they want to be in their career. So they tend to be more focused on the skill than the leaders sometimes are.
Okay. And what subtle behaviors can, again, quietly erode a leader's credibility over time? Because I think that happens and it's not in our face and it's not bold. And so we're not paying a lot of attention to it. It's kind of, again, like that quiet thing that's happening.
It's when you lose the ability to see things through that other's perspective. Right? When you are talking, there's a curse of knowledge piece, and it's not just, there's jargon and there's big words, right? But there's also like forgetting what it is to struggle, forgetting what it is to not have the money to pay for a health procedure, not really listening to the only way that you can get that information and remember what it's like. If you've never experienced these things, learn what it's like is by asking questions and getting curious and talking to people. And if you're not doing that and you're either assuming you know what their experience is or just not even trying to care what that experience is, you are chipping away at your credibility in a way that is almost impossible to recover from.
That reminds me of something that happened recently, and it's interesting how you draw back on your lived experiences. We, right after Thanksgiving, we had an issue with our payroll system. And first of all, messing with people's money can cause a fierce reaction, like just baseline, we understand that. But there was something more to this. And so people were only going to get paid a portion of their pay. And it happened to be falling on Black Friday. So right after Thanksgiving, when everyone goes shopping, and I felt this visceral reaction as to how to handle this. Directly back from my lived experience, before I ever became a nurse, I was a nursing assistant. And we're kind of the lowest rung on the ladder and are paid the least. And I distinctly remembered a time when I had this tradition where I'd go take my son out and we'd go out Black Friday shopping. That was when stores would still open at like 7 p.m. after Thanksgiving dinner. And so we had this really cool tradition, and I'd stop and get Starbucks, and we'd go to Walmart and Target and do all of the things. Well, I could close my eyes and still feel like I was in this situation. We were at Walmart, carts full of things, and I had to just kind of make things up to like get us to navigate till midnight, because I didn't have enough money in my account to be able to cover what was in that basket, but I knew my check would come in at midnight. So we did lots of fun things, but ultimately as a mom, I was sitting there going, oh my gosh, I can't complete this transaction. And so I sent an email to the CEO of the payroll company, and I just said, hey, look, here's a bit of my experience and why I feel so passionately about this. Whatever lever you can pull to be able to, I don't care if you break it out into 2 checks, but so that everyone gets paid so that they can do the things that they need to do, because it's really important. He did what he needed to do. He pulled all the people in. We got it done. But that really drove me. And I think lived experiences that we draw back on can guide our future actions.
100%. But also, and you have to recognize and give yourself, let it land. Well, I talk a lot about evidence. There's a lot of strong evidence there, Sonnie, that you are self-aware enough to remember those moments and to have let those moments be part of the leader that you are. A lot of people don't let that land inside of them or don't even tap back into it. They're busy. You could have very easily been like, oh, they'll get paid when they get paid. I've got to move on. I've got to do other things. I've got so much going on. It's just not something that you even think about. And so hopefully leaders are like you and tap back into that learned experience. But if they're not, the great thing is to have people around you who remind you of that and that are comfortable enough and have enough psychological safety at the organization that they can speak up when you don't have the lived experience to
Right.
tap into. But you're right. When you do, and you have the emotional intelligence to use that lived experience, it's wonderful. I also hope that your team knows that you did that because it is difficult to build credibility. Everything that we want people to believe is based on evidence.
Hmm.
And so as a leader, you have to be vulnerable enough, and that word gets thrown around a lot, but to give your team evidence that you are credible. And so when I talk about the belief triangle, the believe you side is that make promises and keep them, set expectations and meet them. And that's making payroll, right? The other part of that is sometimes you can't. And when you can't, you own it. Now,
Hmm.
here you did, but if you almost didn't, or you had to do some things in order to do that, it's worthwhile to share that with some people on your team, not in a self-serving way, but just so that people know that behind the scenes, you are doing everything you can to be the leader that they want you to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you mentioned another thing, and that's vulnerability. And I think so often what I see is, and even what I experienced early on is I didn't want anyone to know the missteps or the wrong turns that I had taken. And I took a lot of time to actually prevent people from knowing that. And I got to a point in my career where I just said, gosh, I have learned so much from other people sharing with me. I have all of these experiences that could actually serve somebody else. And so that was kind of the point of starting this podcast was how can I share the good, the bad, and the ugly? Because that's what our journey to greatness is. It's not filled with roses all the time. And if we can share those things, that then, first of all, gives people a realistic view of what you have to navigate. And number two, it gives them permission to feel like they can mess up, learn the lesson totally. And then they too can share with others.
Yeah, and it's such a credibility boost. Honestly, I can't tell you the number of times that I have seen and talk to jurors afterwards that when a expert or a witness makes a mistake and says, yeah, I got that right, but here's why I did wrong, but this is why it doesn't matter, or I got that wrong, but then I fixed it. It's a huge credibility boost because they see that you're willing to admit that you're not perfect. You're willing to admit that you make mistakes and then you fix them. You don't want to just say I made a mistake and then I left it there, right?
Right.
That's a credibility herder. But if you are able to own some of your missteps, it's a huge credibility boost. And it's one that you can't manufacture.
Right. Yeah. How can leaders project authority without overpowering the room or kind of performing confidence?
Well, I think that as the more powerful you become, the less you should be talking, right? Like you want to make sure that you're doing more listening than talking as you become more powerful. When you think about the charisma piece, there's a lot in the charisma piece that's about listening. You can't tell a story that's going to resonate with your people unless you understand them. And that doesn't happen unless you've listened. Metaphors are even more powerful than stories. But metaphors can either land or miss. You don't understand the person you're talking to. And so leaders really want to tap into their listening skills and their compassion skills and their ability to see things from the other's perspective so that they can then enter into a room in a way that is magnetizing, and magnetic. I think that, and I think really good leaders know this. They know they don't have to go in power posing and talking and being loud, but rather, that the silence speaks volumes and it's really, really effective.
Yeah. In high stakes moments, conflict, crisis, resistance, how does credibility change the outcome of that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's two things about this. With conflict, it depends on the kind of conflict. Sometimes we're in conflict and a third party is the decider. So that's in the courtroom, yes. But if you are, so for example, if it's you or somebody else that's up for a job, and so there's a sort of conflict there, or up for a promotion, or up for a resource, and a leader is going to give you that resource, or if you and someone else are having a disagreement and the board is ultimately going to decide, that's the type of conflict where you want your credibility to be as strong or stronger than the other person, because you want to make sure that your board or your team or your leader believes in you, and believes that you can help them. The more common type of conflict is the type where the other person is the one you want to persuade. Right. So, and then that's where we can get sort of confused, because it's like, well, I need to convince them so much. You need to understand them so that you can be understood. It is very unlikely that if you just keep arguing your points with someone who has counterpoints, that you are going to win that argument, that conflict. So you've really got to start with understanding where they're coming from. I often say when you communicate, you share perspectives. When you advocate, you change them. And in those situations, you've got to communicate first, and then you can start advocating. But if you don't understand their perspective and really try to understand it, you're going to have a very difficult time changing it.
Yeah. And I've seen, speaking of conflict, I've seen kind of one side of the spectrum to the other, right? You've got the passive environments where nobody wants to have any disruptions, and it's everybody just, nods and agrees, even though nobody may agree inside of the room, but it's a very passive environment. And I've been a part of situations where it's a very aggressive environment, one that isn't necessarily healthy. Do you think there is such a thing as healthy conflict?
Absolutely. I think that there is such a thing as healthy conflict. I think that when we think of it as conflict, it starts to change it into something that's less healthy. But it happens oftentimes, in healthy relationships. There's disagreements that you can talk through and come to a resolution, come to compromises. And that could be phrased as conflict. I often say that difficult conversation is an opinion, right? Some people love to argue. Some people love to fight. Those people often become lawyers because they love to, right? They love to argue and they love to fight. But other people love to find things that work for everybody. It reminds me of when I'm also a trained mediator, and we take conflict resolution classes. And there's like a story that we tell there where there's this mediator and these two people are in this huge conflict over an orange. And the mediator's running back and forth and trying to figure out how to get them to agree to somehow split the orange, and they won't, and they won't. And then ultimately he goes into one of the groups and he says, "What do you want this orange for anyway?" And the first group says, "Oh, we have a bartending class and we want this beautiful rind to dress all of our cocktails." And then he was like, "Oh, that's interesting." And he goes into the other room and he says, "What did you want the orange for?" And she says, "Oh, I own this juice bar and we want the juice for our juices." And it turns out that both sides could have exactly what they wanted, not taking anything from the other. But without asking these questions, you don't get there. And so if you go into a situation thinking this is conflict and conflict is this, like fighting and hard and war, you're going to miss the compromises that are there and accessible in a way that everyone can win. And so a lot of it is just, your belief creates your reality. It's a big part of my work. And if you believe this is going to be a difficult conversation, it's going to be a difficult conversation. If you believe it's going to be a conflict, it most likely is. But if you believe it's going to be discovery, exploratory, meeting of the minds, you are much more likely to get that result.
Okay, this is where we hit the pause button. Before you go, next week's conversation with Heather gets even more practical. In part 2, we dive into what leaders instinctively do wrong during conflict, how to calm your nervous system in high-stakes conversations, why social media is reshaping credibility and influence, and how to build confidence that actually shows up in your voice. If part 1 challenged how you think about credibility, part 2 will show you how to apply it when the pressure is on. See you next week. If today's episode challenged you, moved you, or lit a fire in your soul, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with somebody who's ready to rise. Could I ask you to take 30 seconds to leave a review? It's the best way to say thank you and help this show reach more bold leaders like you. Because this isn't just a podcast, it's a movement. We're not here to play small. We're here to lead loud, one bold and unapologetic step at a time. Until next time, stay bold, stay grounded, and make moves that make mediocre uncomfortable.